Welcome back. So we're still Black Augusting because it's still August. The topic here is the US government entraps Black people into committing crimes, and I'm using the originator of Black August, George Lester Jackson, as this example. The US criminal justice system reveals more about the character of the US and its people than it does the character of the imprisoned. The US is 5% of the world's population and incarcerates a quarter of the world's population. The majority of the people in prison are poor, aka the US hates the poor and prefers to incarcerate them rather than help them. Research conducted in 2023 revealed violent crime was found to be related mainly to income inequality and lower academic achievement in the community. Race was unrelated to violent crime after controlling for other factors. And police shootings were found to be related to community levels of mental health concerns, food insecurity, and the municipality's violent crime rate. Though poverty and access to education are the key determinants of engaging in crime, because the US is a racialized or racist society, the incarceration rates are driven by race. Please permit me to read the incarceration rates and reveal the most targeted and hated racial group in the US. I'm starting from the bottom. Most of these people are poor. At the bottom, we have the white imprisonment rate, and it's 188 per 100,000 people. Next in line, we have Hispanics or Latinx, and their rate is 426 per 100,000 people. Above that, we have Indigenous Americans, and their prison rate is 801 per 100,000. And topping it out, we have Black imprisonment rate 911 per 100,000. And to repeat, crime is driven by poverty and poor access to education. So the most hated in the US are Indigenous peoples and Black people. And you know what those two groups have in common? A history of systemic oppression by the US government. Hating and targeting your own citizens based on ethnicity is a crime against humanity. I'm going to move away from the statistics because your eyes might have glazed over on that one and focus on the individual, George Lester Jackson, and how the US government entrapped him into committing crimes by creating the conditions that would make criminal activity an acceptable option and by violating his constitutional rights. First, the legal definition of entrapment, according to Cornell Law School, is an affirmative defense in which a defendant claims that the law enforcement or a state agent induced them to commit a criminal act they otherwise would not have committed. So let me introduce you to George Lester Jackson. George Lester Jackson was born on September 23, 1941, the second of 5 children to Georgia and Lester Jackson. Jackson's father was employed as a postal service worker, and his mother was a stay-at-home caregiver who was overly protective and tried to keep him inside the home. The family lived in a segregated neighborhood of Chicago's West Side. In kindergarten, when George for the first time saw a white person, he, in curiosity, touched the child's hair and felt his cheek, and the white child responded by knocking George out with a baseball bat. George's mother responded by transferring him to a private Catholic school named St. Malachy, which was also segregated. The one for the black children was poorly equipped and dilapidated, while across the street from it, the one for the white children was, you know it, well equipped. George would spend summers to get away from that nonsense in his mother's hometown of Harrisburg, Illinois, with his maternal grandmother and aunt, and there he loved the freedom as well as learning to use guns and rifles for hunting. After his parents had his fourth sibling, they were forced to move to a larger apartment in a more poverty-stricken, dangerous neighborhood. Jackson began to sneak out of the house and engage in deviant behaviors that are labeled as petty crimes. At the age of 9, he began to have run-ins with the police. Like run-ins with the police. What other white child was having run-ins with the police? It was like, if you're paying black children the most negative attention, you're going to have run-ins with them. Next, the family moved to Troop Street housing project, even more dangerous, more poverty-stricken, with more opportunities to engage in deviant behaviors, petty crimes. Jackson was now a teenager, and like youth at that developmental stage, he was increasingly rebellious, trying to find his autonomy, trying to hear his own voice, trying to have his own mind. And so he escalated from shoplifting to mugging. In 1956, his father attempted to address his behavior and transferred to another postal service in Los Angeles, California. And like a typical teenager who craved peer group interaction and not having access to a positive peer group, Jackson joined a gang called the Capones. So beginning in January 1957, at the age of 16, he would have a series of arrests, starting with an allegation of stealing a motorbike. But as a minor, he was always released into his father's custody. However, a department store break-in resulted in him being incarcerated in Paso Robles, a youth facility in Los Angeles. He spent 7 months there. He reported liking the food and having time to read. I don't know, but when you like institutional food, it means maybe you had a lack in your home of food, but I'll read on. Not long after being released, he participated in and pled guilty to a robbery of the Bakersfield gas station. When tried, he mischievously tied up a fellow inmate who was scheduled to be released. Then he pretended to be that inmate and left. He escaped to Harrisburg, Illinois, where he spent his summers, but he was brought back. He was returned to Paso Robles Youth Facility, where he remained until June of 1960. I don't know about you, but I did some mischievous things as a child. I'd climb neighbors' yards, pick fruit, do mischievous things. But because people saw me as a child, they treated me like a child. I didn't get in any trouble. But yeah, maybe you were a perfect child, but all I see there are mischievous child and teen things. If you could not tell, George Jackson was poor, and you remember the research I quoted at the beginning, that poverty and lack of access to educational opportunities are greater predictors of crime than race. I'll read an interview that his mother did talking about her 2 sons, George and Jonathan. And her name was Georgia Jackson, as I said already. Georgia Jackson talking. We were poor. We were very poor. We lived in a cold water flat, but it was nice. It looked like a little dollhouse on the inside. Reporter, how was that? Because I painted it and I fixed it up nice, kept it clean. Everybody was always surprised when they came into our flat by the way it looked. You know, the outside, where it was located, the way it looked inside. Reporter, when you say you were poor, how poor were you? Mother, very poor. We lived perhaps Back in the 40s, my husband would make probably $19 to $20 per week. We'd always buy baby food first. If anything was left, we'd buy something for ourselves. If not, we wouldn't eat. That's how poor we were. Reporter: did George ever talk to you about the fact that he was black and you were black and from a poor family? Did he ever discuss that? Mother: I used to talk to him about that. I used to tell them that they were black, and in order to achieve, they had to be twice as good as whites. And if you were twice as good as whites, then maybe you'd make it. Yes, that is what I used to tell them. It is the truth, so why would I hide it from them? End quote. When people go from generations of enslavement and are so-called, quote, freed without being given reparations to elevate them to the level of others in the society, their poverty is a policy choice by the U.S. government. When the government allow unfair labor laws that block black people from equal access to job opportunity, that poverty is government sponsored. When the government creates housing laws and redlining that force black people to live in impoverished areas, that's called government sponsored poverty. So I'm going to quote something from Abeje, a sister from the Associated Press, writing about George Jackson. Quote, George Jackson was 18 when he was arrested for robbing a gas station of $71 in Los Angeles in 1960. You heard it, $71. He was convicted and given an indeterminate sentence of 1 year to life and spent the next decade at California's Soledad and San Quentin prisons, much of it in solitary confinement. What she left out of this paragraph was that he was told to plead guilty by his lawyer to avoid the harsh sentencing of the 3-strike rule, but he got the sentencing anyway. I listed all of Jackson's petty, deviant crimes and his parents' attempts to intervene, and the absence of any U.S. government intervention to actively help him go down another path. But even without any of that information, a reasonable person could see that a sentence of 1 year to life to a teenager for allegedly stealing $71 was in violation of the 8th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which records, quote, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. Even the minimum sentence of a year was cruel and unusual punishment, and fiscally irresponsible in terms of wasting taxpayers' money. The judge's logic that a teenager placed in prison, along with people who are more entrenched in criminal activity, would become cooperative is naive, even wicked. Additionally, this kind of cruel and unusual punishment causes righteous indignation and resentment towards the criminal injustice system and the society. I won't address the alleged crimes Jackson committed while incarcerated, because if he was not placed in prison by the U.S. government, none of this would have occurred. Additionally, he was never tried nor found guilty of any of them. He spent 10 years in prison and 7 of those years in solitary confinement for $71. Back to George Jackson. Not provided a good opportunity for education by the U.S. government, Jackson pursued his own in prison. Abeje from the AP Press wrote, while incarcerated, Jackson began studying the words of revolutionary theoreticians such as Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, who advocated class awareness, challenging institutions, and overturning capitalism through revolution. He read founding leaders of the Panthers, including Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, who were also inspired by Marx, Lenin, and Chinese communist leader Mao. Jackson became a leader in the personal rights movement. His letters from prison to loved ones and supporters were compiled in the best-selling books Soledad, Brother, and Blood in the Eye. And what was it like for his mother to visit her child in prison? Quote, I always look forward, but I hate to leave. That is the bad part. You have to leave him there. And I can't make you understand because you never experienced it. But when we would go visit him and they would take him back, and I would have to look at his back walk away from us when I knew he wanted to go home with us so bad, so very bad. That's the part that hurt. Sounds like slavery again, right? When you just rip the child away from his family. George Jackson would lose another son, Jonathan Jackson. Jonathan Jackson, George Jackson's 17-year-old brother, who idealized him, tried to assist James McLean on trial for an alleged attempt to stab an officer. He tried to help him escape from the courthouse. During the escape attempt, George Jackson, with William Christmas and Russell McGee, two prisoners who were in the courtroom as witnesses for McLean, took 5 hostages, 3 jurors, the district attorney, and the judge. To effect their escape, Jackson and his associates tapped a shotgun to the judge's neck, and as they were leaving the Marin County Courthouse with the hostages, Jackson and the others were reported to have shouted, "We want the Soledad brothers freed by 12:30 today," thus indelibly imprinting in the public mind a relationship between the kidnapping and the Soledad brothers. That was George Jackson's brother. Georgia Jackson speaking to a reporter about losing both her sons. Reporter, why did Tom do what he did? His name isn't Tom, but go ahead. The mother said, I think he did it for love of his brother and also love of his country. I think he probably, and I try not to analyze him because nobody knows what he was thinking, Jonathan. She makes sure to say her child's name. It's not Tom, it's Jonathan. I think he did it for the love of his brother and his country. He was trying to wake the people of this country up to the fact that Black people had nothing. We had nothing in this country, and he was trying to illustrate that to the people. That's what I think. Reporter, did Jonathan know that he would probably be killed in the attempt? Mother, I think he probably knew it. Pretty sure that he was intelligent, and I would know that I would be killed if I tried something like that. I raised my children to love people. I raised my children to mingle in American society, but American society did not want them. Reporter, do you think that George's death was inevitable given the kinds of things he was saying and writing? Mother, they would not let him live. There is no way possible that they could let him live. He was a Black man. They are afraid that people are beginning to listen, and they had people all over the world began to listen to George. They had, and I certainly know people in this country had. That's the reason why they framed him to be murdered the way he was, trying to discredit everything he said, trying to paint him as insane, maniac, an animal. That's the reason for it. Reporter. Could he be violent? Mother. Only if people were violent to him, I could be violent also. And I imagine so could you. You see, that is the whole story of America. They take their violence and turn it around on somebody else. I don't have to talk about America's violence. You can look all over the world to see American soldiers everywhere fighting in other people's country and killing them. If I were running the country in America, I would not open my mouth and talk about violence. As many people as they murdered in Vietnam in the past 10 years, and then they talk about violence, as many people that they kill every day in this country and nobody cares or knows. As many black people that they kill every day in this country and nobody knows or cares. You want to tell me about violence? How they wiped out a whole nation of Indians and say something to me about violence? I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear whether George Lester Jackson was good or bad. If you didn't put these people in this situation, if there were attempts to help them, George Jackson would perhaps be a professor somewhere in a school. That should have been his life. You tell me what you think. Thanks for listening.